Imagine it. An orange princess, daughter of a king, doesn't sweep down the grand staircase with a practiced smile and a measured curtsy. She slips out through a side door, while behind her, doors close quite literally and unmistakably across an entire world. Not because she is renouncing the crown, not because war has erupted, but because she chooses a man the court would scarcely acknowledge as a man of consequence at all. Her coachman, Johannes van Rossum, and, as if that were not incendiary enough for polite society, he is already married. Around 1845, a chill runs through drawing rooms from The Hague to Berlin. Princess Marianne has left her husband, Prince Albrecht of Prussia. A princess walking away from a dynastic marriage is scandal enough. But what follows is, by the standards of the 19th century, almost unthinkable. Marianne does not simply travel and wait for gossip to fade. She does something far more dangerous. She lives openly. She buys Rusthof in Vorburg and turns a house into a statement here. She sets the rules. And then comes the moment everyone fears, yet no one dares say aloud. She is pregnant. A princess still bound by the expectations of bloodline and protocol, carrying the child of a man from her household staff. In the eyes of the elite, it is not merely improper. It is an existential threat to the image monarchy depends upon. Suddenly, it is no longer a rumor, but a crisis. The courts scramble, papers are signed at last, and the separation is formalized, yet the price has already been set. When Marianne later gives birth in Sicily, it is as though an invisible stamp is pressed upon her name. Cast out, The Hague turns away, Berlin turns away. Prussia imposes restrictions that feel less like etiquette and more like exile. And Marianne? She remains with her choice, with her child, with a love that shatters what society insists is worthy. So how does a woman, born into gold, rules and obligation, come to a point where she would rather lose everything than spend one more day pretending she is content? To understand that, we must go back long before the scandal to the young Marianne, before anyone called her a threat. Before Marianne became a name whispered in marble corridors, she was simply a child, born not in the Netherlands, but in Berlin. Exile was not a choice in her story. It was the beginning of it. She arrived as the much younger child of a dynasty that had already spent years in flight from Napoleon. A little girl among older brothers, with the absence of a sister who had not survived. That sort of household can make one of two things happen. It can make a child very small or fiercely self-reliant. When the family returns to The Hague, everything appears to settle back into place. Palaces, carriages, court music, ceremony. But normality at court is often little more than scenery. Behind it stand parents preoccupied with nation-building, power, status, and survival. Her father, King Willem I, is occupied with statecraft and authority. Her mother, Wilhelmine of Prussia, with rank, connection, and dynastic order. Somewhere inside all of that, Marianne grows up with a lesson that is never spoken plainly, yet is impossible to miss. You belong here, yet you are not the center of it. Her upbringing is strict, polished, elevated. Governesses enforce discipline. Lessons shape her into what a princess is expected to be. But warmth is not the same thing as etiquette, and affection is not the same thing as approval. In Marianne's early world, love often feels conditional. One is noticed when one fits the picture. One learns to smile at the right moment, to remain silent when the room belongs to adults, and above all, to understand that feelings are dangerous because feelings ruin appearances. Even language reflects that dislocation. Marianne grows up between German and French, with Dutch belonging to her position more than to her instincts. As though, from the very beginning, she is slightly foreign even within her own family. Perhaps that is why she later finds it so easy to travel, to disappear, to begin again elsewhere. Those who never feel fully rooted can also learn, rather early, how to live with the ground shifting beneath them. Then there is an early disappointment that rarely receives the attention it deserves. An engagement to Gustav, the former crown prince of Sweden, which is later withdrawn because politics decides it is no longer suitable. The lesson lands brutally. Her heart, she discovers, is negotiable. Her future can be revised like a diplomatic file. From that point onward, love ceases to resemble a fairy tale. It becomes a risk, and once a woman learns that other people are entitled to decide her happiness, she may one day become absolutely determined to decide for herself. Set against that is Albrecht, formed by a Prussian world of drill, order, hierarchy, and masculine control. A man in whom discipline comes so naturally that it nearly replaces intimacy. Outwardly, such a match looks ideal: royal blood, political sense, impeccable presentation. But inwardly, the fault lines are already there before the first real quarrel ever begins. What happens when a woman who cannot wholly lie to herself is placed inside a marriage where silence is not merely expected, but required? Outwardly, Marianne appears to possess precisely the sort of life for which portraits are painted. An orange princess, married to a Prussian prince, moving through palaces, uniforms, chandeliers, state dinners, and ceremonial visits. Her likeness is presented as calm, composed, and untouchable, as though she were not quite a woman, but a symbol. And that is precisely where the trap lies. At court, happiness is rarely something one feels. More often, it is something one performs. Marianne learns how to enter a room without faltering, how to smile while her stomach tightens, how to remain poised when a jest is really a slight. She is admired for her taste, her refinement, her eye for art and culture. A woman of elegance, discernment, and social ease, even within the harder, colder atmosphere of Prussia. But prestige, even the royal variety, can be a stage production with very little light behind the curtain. There, beyond the glow of chandeliers and official appearances, Marianne is living inside a marriage that hangs upon her like a uniform, rigid, correct, and almost entirely without tenderness. Albrecht moves through his world with military certainty, while Marianne longs for something altogether different: conversation, warmth, a sense of being seen without rank attached to it. And when one shares a life with a person who does not truly reach for one, not with the hands alone, but with the heart and attention, every public smile becomes slightly more expensive. So she compensates. She travels. She clings to beauty, a landscape, a concert room, a library, an artist's studio. She begins building a life out of places, out of rooms where she herself may close the door. She acquires estates and retreats, creating small private worlds in which she does not have to be princess every second she breathes. It looks like privilege, and in one sense, it is. But it is also escape dressed in velvet. And all the while, the distance between image and reality grows wider. The higher one's rank, the less permission one has to break. Marianne feels that acutely. Every time she threatens to become too honest, the system presses her back into its frame. Remain composed, remain dignified. Above all, do not cause a scandal. But that pressure begins to produce something profoundly dangerous to a dynasty, a will of her own. Because when no one grants you freedom, there comes a moment when you may decide to take it for yourself, not with a speech, not with a revolution, but with a relationship that simply ought not to exist. And it is at precisely that fragile turning point, when Marianne's life is already fissured beneath its golden surface, that someone appears near enough to see her without the crown. Not a prince, not a diplomat, not a man from her own rank, but someone from her immediate world. Someone who knows her routine, her movements, her silences. Johannes van Rossum. And from that moment onwards, this ceases to be a story about glitter and presentation. It becomes a story about a choice that will cost her almost everything. It does not begin with some grand declaration. It begins with proximity, with the presence of a man who is still there after the room has emptied, a man who does not look at her first as the daughter of Willem, but as a woman exhausted by decorum. By March 1848, when Marianne settles herself at Rusthof in Voorburg, she brings with her not merely trunks and household staff, but something far more volatile, the longing to be seen without the burden of role or title. Johannes van Rossum offers precisely that sort of presence, her personal coachman, later her travelling companion, a man who knows her rhythm when she wishes to leave, when she cannot bear another moment, when silence means more than words. In a life where everyone seems to want something from her, a smile, a signature, a dutiful performance of contentment, he appears to ask for nothing but nearness. And that, in itself, makes him dangerous. Because this love is wrong according to every rule Marianne has ever been taught, not merely because he is no prince, but because he is already married, a man with a wife in The Hague, a marriage that does not simply vanish because passion has entered the room. It is not a minor detail, it is an alarm bell, a warning that cannot be softened by romance. And yet Marianne chooses, quite deliberately, to look at what she feels rather than what society insists cannot be allowed to exist. At first, that choice is intoxicating. It feels like breaking a chain. Everything that has been imposed upon her for years, silence, endurance, appearances, is exchanged for something that is unmistakably her own decision. Even Rusthof becomes more than a residence. It becomes a declaration. Here, by the Vliet, in a house large enough to breathe in, Marianne seems to reimagine herself, not as a princess on display, but as a woman arranging her own days. And then it turns. Not with a dramatic quarrel, nor with a shouted confession, but with something far more devastating. Evidence. Only months after her move, it becomes clear that Marianne is pregnant. In that instant, love is transformed into a dossier. No longer a matter to be whispered behind fans or in lamplit corridors, but a crisis to be managed by courts and dynasties. For a princess to be carrying the child of a man from her own household staff, and a man not even free to marry her, is not merely scandal. It is a fracture line running through the carefully polished myth monarchy tells about itself. From that point onward, it becomes the oldest and most perilous story of all, us against the world, which sounds romantic until one understands what it does in practice. It closes every exit. Marianne realizes that any step backwards would not return her to safety, but to humiliation, control, and a life in which her body and choices once again belong to others. So she presses on. Van Rossum becomes not merely a lover, but a constant presence traveling with her, sharing her daily world, eventually occupying a place within the machinery of her private life. And the more he fills her days, the narrower her world becomes. Because the price of this love is isolation, in The Hague and Berlin, Marianne is no longer looked upon as a daughter or sister, but as a problem. The distance is felt not always in confrontation, but in silence. Invitations that no longer arrive, names no longer spoken, doors that remain closed. What at first resembles freedom, a life beyond the court, slowly reveals itself also as a form of loneliness she cannot share with old friends, because every conversation now carries judgment. And here lies the truly poisonous element. Not necessarily violence, but structure. Marianne has placed everything upon a single card: her reputation, her position, her access to the world she came from. If this love should fail her, little remains except the scandal itself. And that knowledge does not make the relationship calmer. It makes it more consuming, more clinging, more defensive, more bound up with a terrifying thought. If I surrender this, I surrender myself. By the time rumor becomes pregnancy, even the courts are forced to bend. At the end of March 1849, the formal divorce is finally granted, not because anyone honors Marianne's choice, but because they fear an even greater public explosion if they do not. And when she gives birth later that year in Sicily, the romantic dream is finished. What remains is consequence. Love has freed her from one system of rules only to imprison her within another. A life in which she will forever be remembered as that princess, the woman who dared everything, and for that very reason, lost everything. By early March 1848, Rusthof in Voorburg still appears to be what any elegant country house along the Vliet ought to be: graceful, secluded, almost idyllic. A main residence, stables, a coach house, an orangery, everything orderly, everything serene. But on 7 March, that address becomes something else entirely. Princess Marianne moves in, and not alone, not discreetly, not in a manner the court can plausibly explain away. She arrives with the man whose name is already causing jaws to tighten in The Hague and Berlin alike: Johannes van Rossum, her coachman, her companion, and, yes, a man still legally tied to another woman. From that moment, the story shifts from whispers to facts. A princess retreating from public life can still be described as tired, sensitive, perhaps overwrought. A princess openly living with a servant is something altogether more dangerous. It is a provocation. It is as though Marianne, after years inside a marriage, where she was expected chiefly to smile, endure, and remain silent, has made one astonishingly simple declaration: "I shall not perform for you any longer." And then comes the development that even the most loyal court official can no longer pretend not to see. Marianne is pregnant. One must imagine the panic in both capitals. Not because anyone suddenly awakens to moral principle, but because pregnancy is proof. It is no longer a rumor one may smother beneath etiquette. It is visible, undeniable, alive. A child will soon exist breathing, named impossible to erase. At that point, this ceases to be a private indiscretion and becomes a dynastic emergency. And there lies the tragedy at the heart of it. The woman who longs for freedom finds her life reduced instead to crisis management. Until then, the courts have still been able to isolate Marianne without fully losing face. They can restrict her movements, contain her social world, keep her children from her within the logic of dynastic order. But a princess visibly carrying the child of another man while still tied, in name at least, to Prince Albrecht, that makes the whole system look absurd. And monarchies can survive many things. Humiliation is not usually one of them. So there is no grand romantic moment, no triumphant proclamation that love has conquered all. Instead, there is paperwork, calculation, and cold administrative necessity. Conversations behind closed doors, lines of decency redrawn in ink. And finally, after years of strain, the decision that had long been approaching becomes unavoidable. The marriage must formally end. On 28 March 1849, the divorce is officially granted. On paper, it is an ending. In reality, it is merely the beginning of her punishment. Because once the marriage no longer exists to preserve the image, what remains is judgment. Marianne has done it. She has crossed the line. She has chosen. She has, in the eyes of her class, dragged herself down by her own hand. And judgment does not always arrive with noise. Often it seeps in quietly. Letters unanswered, invitations withdrawn, relatives who do not confront, but simply turn away, as though Marianne is no longer a woman at all, but a warning. And then, as if history wishes to sharpen the scene even further, the story moves to a place that feels almost cinematic in its distance. Cefalù, Sicily, far from The Hague, far from Berlin, far enough, perhaps, to breathe for a moment, yet nowhere near far enough to escape the verdict. On 30 October 1849, Marianne gives birth there to a son, Johannes Willem van Reinhardtshausen. And the child is, from the first instant, more than a child. He is a symbol, a living piece of evidence, a shadow cast across her name. One can only wonder what passed through her mind in those days. Not merely the fear of childbirth, but the greater fear of what would follow it. For even if one has trained oneself to lose everything, one terror remains unbearable, that one's child should inherit the full cost of one's choice. And that is, in effect, what happens. Shortly after the birth, both the Hague and Berlin sever relations with her. From Prussia comes an especially brutal measure, a formal restriction that leaves Marianne scarcely tolerated on Prussian soil at all. The message is chilling in its precision. You may exist, but not among us. You may live, but not within our world. You may love, but you will do so in exile. Meanwhile, beyond palace walls, the public machine works exactly as such machines always do. Some whisper that Marianne has been overtaken by reckless passion, almost by madness. Others see something quite different, a woman who has finally refused to remain humiliated in silence. Society judges her, certainly, but it also, in some quarters, cannot help admiring her. For who, even with every advantage in the world, dares walk so directly into ruin rather than submit? And that leaves the question hanging in the air, the question that makes this story so unsettling. If everyone could see the disaster unfolding, why did no one truly intervene? Not to force her back into a cage, but to prevent a woman and a child from being quietly erased from the family narrative. Once the divorce exists on paper, there is no relief, only reckoning. For a court, marriage is never merely private sentiment. It is a contract with the world. Marianne has broken that contract, and law now begins to serve a second purpose, not to protect her, but to contain her. The message is unmistakable, even if no one dares phrase it so plainly. You may continue to exist, but you shall no longer belong. In The Hague and Berlin, the line hardens. Connections dry up, as though someone has quietly removed the oxygen from the room. Relatives do not stage dramatic confrontations. They simply fall silent. And silence, in such a world, is never neutral. It is judgment in its coldest form. The cruelest step comes from the Prussian side, an official order of exclusion that makes Marianne all but invisible on Prussian soil. Not quite. Do not come back, something more humiliating than that. She may enter, but only briefly. Barely 24 hours at a time limit placed upon one's own past, as though her very name has become contagious to palace walls. Then there is the matter of the children from her marriage to Albrecht. In such cases, it is not the heart that decides, but the system. Children are treated as dynastic continuity, as property of lineage, as proof of order. Marianne therefore loses not only rank, but the ordinary reality of motherhood itself. What remains are structured encounters, permissions, conditions, moments in which a mother is made to feel like a visitor in her own family. The public, meanwhile, sees chiefly the scandal and not the juridical humiliation beneath it. Society speaks of the princess who ran away, as though she had stepped into some reckless romance of her own making. But the truth is harsher. She is not transformed into a free heroine, but into a problem to be managed administratively. Every document, every restriction, every closed door sends a message to other women of her class. Do not attempt this. And then the story darkens still further, with one detail the courts would have preferred never to see placed beside Marianne's name in the same sentence. Johannes van Rossum remains legally married. There is no respectable remarriage, no elegant solution, no socially acceptable ending. Marianne's new life therefore acquires no stamp of legitimacy in the eyes of the world. She lives in a permanent condition of exception, where love is at once her refuge and her stigma. And yet she does not return. She builds, she travels, she supports artists and causes. She acquires places where she can still breathe. But it remains a life lived with conditions attached. Every time she crosses a frontier, the punishment travels with her, not in chains, but in absences. The court that no longer speaks her name, the family that no longer defends her, the society that reduces an entire woman to a single word: scandal. And that is the truly bitter aftershock of it all. Legally, the matter may be concluded, but socially, it is a sentence for life. Marianne may be formally divorced, yet she is never truly absolved. At the end of this story, there is no triumphant reconciliation, no grand return to court, no final family portrait in which everything is forgiven and neatly arranged. What remains is something quieter, and perhaps for that very reason more haunting. A woman who stepped so far beyond the line that the line itself had to erase her in order to preserve its own authority. Marianne does not disappear from the world, but she is pushed out of its center. And yet, even in that exile, she builds again. Not in The Hague, not in Berlin, but at the edge of both memory and belonging, close enough to Prussia to remain within reach of her children, but far enough to avoid living every day beneath the shadow of a shut gate. At Schloss Reinhardtshausen, she does not merely hide, she creates. A world of art, music, hospitality, patronage. A life that, in its own way, answers the cruelty of exclusion with cultivation. It is as though she says, "If you cut me out of your world, I shall make another one." And then there is her son, the child at the center of the scandal, the child whose very existence turned whispers into catastrophe. Marianne tries to give him what the world around her refuses to offer, not simply a name, but a future, something more than gossip, something more than shame. It is perhaps the most human aspect of the entire saga. A woman may learn to endure punishment herself, but she cannot easily bear the thought of her child being sentenced for her choices as well. What, then, is Marianne's legacy? Not legislation, not reform in any formal sense. She does not alter the structure of monarchy through decree or movement. She leaves behind something more uncomfortable than that. An example: a woman within a system of bloodline, decorum, and control, who finally says, in effect, "I will not remain an ornament." In her own century, that is labeled disgrace. In a later age, one may see something else in it: a ferocious insistence upon personal agency, purchased at a cost most people would never be willing to pay. And the final image is perhaps the bitterest of all. When Johannes van Rossum dies, he is not embraced by the world that once judged them. And when Marianne herself dies, she is buried beside the man for whom she surrendered rank, security, and acceptance. Yet even then, history cannot quite resist one last act of reduction. On paper, in memory, in the official version of things, she is still too often defined by what the system says she was, rather than by what she chose to be. Perhaps that is her true inheritance, that love does not always end in vindication, that courage does not always look noble in its own time, and that long before such ideas were fashionable, one princess showed just how ruthless the world can become when a woman born to represent a dynasty insists, at last, on becoming fully human.